On Friday, the US Supreme Court ruled that any tariffs imposed via the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, were illegal. In practice, this means that most of Trump's post-Liberation Day tariffs now have to be withdrawn. So in this video, we thought we'd explain the ruling itself, why it's bad news for Trump's political project, and why it's also bad news for America's public finances. Trump was the world's most influential person in our recent ranking. So in the latest issue of our magazine, Too Long, we explain how he retained his top position, and why that strong result might actually be based on increasingly shaky foundations, as he grapples with unpopularity and divisions within his base. That's just one of the 72 pages in the magazine, because as always, there's more to Too Long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So, to understand this ruling, you need to know a bit of context. According to the Constitution, it's Congress, not the President, who has the authority to impose tariffs. This follows from Article 1, Section 8, which states that the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. However, over time, Congress has delegated more and more of its constitutional powers to the President and executive branch, especially with regards to tariff setting. According to the Congressional Research Service, today there are at least 6 laws that grant the President and the executive the ability to set tariffs without congressional approval. For most of his pre-Liberation Day tariffs, Trump used 3 of these provisions, namely Section 232 of the 1962 Trade Expansion Act and Sections 102 and 103 of the 1974 Trade Act. Trump used Section 232, for instance, which says that the president can impose tariffs on national security grounds, if recommended by the Secretary of Commerce, to impose tariffs on steel and aluminium. He also used Section 201, which says that the president can impose trade barriers on goods that, quote, injure or threaten to injure domestic industries, for tariffs on Chinese solar panels and washing machines. And then he used Section 301, which says that the president can impose tariffs on any foreign government that, quote, violates an international trade agreement or is unjustified, unreasonable, or discriminatory, to impose more tariffs on China. Now, all of these tariffs were legally defensible. After all, you can make a pretty plausible argument the US needs to protect its aluminium and steel industries on national security grounds. Equally, you can make a pretty plausible argument that Chinese trade practices are discriminatory in some sense, and that they threaten to, quote, injure American companies. However, Trump's Liberation Day tariffs, and most of the others since, have been imposed via another piece of legislation, namely the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, commonly known as IEPA. In short, IEPA allows the president to impose wide-ranging tariff restrictions following a presidential declaration of national emergency. Trump had previously used this same law to impose tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada, apparently in response to the unacceptable flow of fentanyl and illegal immigrants into the US. For the Liberation Day tariffs, Trump and White House officials argued that America's trade deficit constituted a national emergency, and justified his tariffs on America's trading partners by pointing to America's bilateral trade deficits. Legally, this was pretty shaky ground for 2 reasons. First, it's not clear that drugs or a trade deficit really constitute emergencies, nor whether IEPA actually gives the president the power to impose tariffs, which is why a number of Trump's advisors previously said that he should rely on other statutes, for fear that IEPA tariffs might ultimately be struck down by the courts. And, well, that's exactly what happened on Friday, when the Supreme Court ruled against IEPA tariffs, largely on the grounds that the IEPA only grants the president the power to, quote, regulate importation, and in the court's opinion, this doesn't mean that he's allowed to impose tariffs. So, what happens now? Well, in a press conference given later in the day, Trump made it clear that he would continue to pursue his tariff agenda, just by other legal means.
So I'm going to just start. Although I firmly disagree with the court's holding today, the decision might not substantially constrain a president's ability to order tariffs going forward. That's because numerous other federal statutes, which is so true, authorize the president to impose tariffs and might justify most, if not all, of the tariffs issued in this case. Even more tariffs, actually. Think of that.
This includes the statutes mentioned earlier, like Section 232 and 201, as well as a new bit of legislation, Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, which Trump apparently plans on using to impose a universal 10% tariff.
Therefore, effective immediately, all national security tariffs under Section 232 and existing Section 301 tariffs. They're existing, they're there. Remain in place, fully in place, and in full force and effect. Today I will sign an order to impose a 10% global tariff under Section 122 over and above our normal tariffs already being charged. And we're also initiating several Section 301 and other investigations to protect our country from unfair trading practices of other countries and companies.
In that press conference, Trump also signaled that he would resist any attempt by businesses or consumers to claim refunds on IEEPA-related tariff payments, despite the fact that his own attorneys conceded during litigation that importers would be entitled to them if tariffs were overturned.
Since Liberation Day, there's about $175 billion in tariff revenue. Do you have to refund?
Very fair question. They take months and months to write an opinion, and they don't even discuss that point. We've taken in hundreds of billions of dollars, not millions, hundreds of billions of dollars. And so I said, well, what happens to all the money that we took in? It wasn't discussed. Wouldn't you think they would have put one sentence in there saying that keep the money or don't keep the money, right? I guess it has to get litigated for the next 2 years. So they write this terrible, defective decision, totally defective. It's almost like not written by smart people. And what they do, they don't even talk about that.
Are you saying that you don't plan to honor refunds for companies that file for them?
I just told you the answer, right? It's not discussed. We'll end up being in court for the next 5 years.
But even if the federal government doesn't have to pay back the $175 billion or so that it's collected already, this ruling is still bad news for America's public finances. As we've detailed in previous videos, Trump has failed to meaningfully reduce federal government spending. In fact, in 2025, total federal spending came in at $7 trillion, slightly above the $6.9 trillion of 2024. The budget deficit was, however, slightly smaller at $1.7 trillion, or 5.4% of GDP in 2025, compared to $2 trillion, or about 6% of GDP in 2024. This was largely down to tariffs, which brought in about $260 billion in revenue. IEEPA tariffs specifically accounted for about 60% of this figure, but their share was growing over time, and they raked in something like $40 billion of revenue in just the first 2 months of this year. Without them, the Treasury could expect to lose out on about $200 to $300 billion a year, pushing the deficit back up towards 6% of GDP. Now, maybe Trump will be able to functionally replace the IEEPA with other statutes, but none of these other statutes give Trump as much power as IEEPA did, or would have done. Section 232, Section 201, and Section 301 all require prior investigations by some department, and can't just be justified by an emergency declaration. Sections 201 and Section 338 are also both limited to 50% tariffs, while Section 122, which is what Trump wants to use to impose his global 10% tariff, is limited to 15%, and requires congressional approval after 150 days. If these other statutes fall short then, it will leave Trump with a large and widening budget deficit, and an economy that looks a lot shakier than it did a week or two ago. Clearly, the current state of the world is plagued by uncertainty and risk. And just while you've been watching this video, your personal information may have been sold or published online without you even knowing about it. And you might just think, well, what's the harm in a few spam calls? But unfortunately, it's not that simple. It might be scary, but scams and identity theft both start with your personal data being exposed online. So that's why we turn to Incogni. Incogni expertly tracks down and removes your data from multiple sites, so that your personal information can't be bought or sold by bad actors online. No longer will your data pop up on online directories, people's search sites, or commercial databases for everyone to see and abuse. They work on your behalf to request your personal data removal, and even conduct repeated removal requests so that you can remain in control. You can even send Incogni sites that expose your data, and they'll send removal requests on your behalf, or assist in you opting out on your own with their custom removals feature. And it's even impacting parts of your life that you never thought about. For example, your health insurance could actually raise your rates just based on your online activity, particularly the data that you enter into health apps. Insurance companies can easily buy that data and decide for themselves just how healthy you are, without you even getting a say. From your phone number to your political affiliation, Incogni can help you find it all and remove it from the internet for good, keeping you protected from the threats you might not even be aware of. Because if they can't find you, they can't harm you. There's no better time to start protecting yourself. So create an account with our link in the description, grant Incogni the ability to work on your behalf, and sit back as they make you safer. Plus, by using code TLDRnews at checkout, you can get an exclusive 60% off their annual Incogni plan. And there's absolutely no risk either with their 30-day money-back guarantee.